The scholarship paperwork described me as a civilian resettlement transfer, academic track, no prior institutional enrollment. That was technically true. I had never attended a secondary institute. I had attended other things instead, for 22 years, in places that do not appear on any map the Velhari Scholastic Authority has ever printed. But the paperwork said civilian, and I had learned, long before Hethdoran, that paperwork is a weapon when you're the one holding the pen. My name is Marit Voss. I am 47 years old. I arrived at Hethdoran Secondary Institute on the third day of the autumn semester carrying 2 bags, a compact resettlement voucher, and a civilian cover so clean it had never been touched by anything except a very patient records clerk and 12 years of careful maintenance. The institute sits in a low equatorial orbit above Earth, one of 6 mixed-species boarding academies constructed under the Reconstruction Accords to demonstrate that we could all learn together now that the shooting had stopped. It accepts human transfers on the Compact Resettlement Scholarship Program. The scholarship is designed for people who lost years to the war and need a credentialed secondary education to re-enter civilian life. I had lost years to the war. That part was accurate. The station smelled of recycled air and ozone and something faintly antiseptic. Every enclosed installation smells slightly different from the others, and you learn to read the smell the way you learn to read anything. It tells you about the life support system's age, the cleaning protocols, the population density, the general level of institutional investment. Hethdoran smelled clean but not sterile, maintained without being pristine. That read as adequate resources, professional staff, a student body large enough to generate real biological noise, all consistent with what the intake documents had described. I took the smallest bunk in the transfer dormitory, the one nearest the door because old habits do not die, and I am not interested in killing them. I arranged my 2 bags under the frame with a precision that anyone watching would have read as the mild tidiness of a person who packed carefully. Then I sat on the mattress and looked at the wall and breathed, for approximately 3 minutes, the way you breathe when you have arrived somewhere and you are taking its measure. You go quiet and you let the space speak. The ventilation pattern, the sound of the adjacent corridors, the distance to the nearest exit, the angle of approach from the door. Not because you expect to need any of this, because you do not know yet what you will need, and information collected early costs nothing but time, and time is the one resource a resettlement transfer in a new posting has in reasonable supply. Then I put on the Institute's standard-issue civilian pullover, which was gray and slightly too large, and I went to find the common room. The common room was on the 4th level, curved like the rest of the station's interior, with long composite tables and bench seating, and a food preparation station that smelled of something the Institute called nutritional broth, and that tasted of nothing I could identify with confidence. About 40 students occupied it at that hour. The majority were Velhari, tall, angular, bony-crested, their skin the pale gray gold of creatures evolved under a cooler sun, moving with the easy authority of species who had been the institutional majority at Hethdoran since its founding. There were 9 humans, mostly young, ages ranging from what I estimated as 15 to 22. 3 Dorathi in a cluster by the food station, heads down, eating with the focused efficiency of people who have learned not to attract attention. I sat at the end of a table near the curved wall with a tray of nutritional broth and a roll of something that passed for bread, and I ate slowly, and I watched. Watching is not the same as starring. I have had 22 years of practice at the distinction. You watch the exits first, then the room's internal geography, then the power gradient, who moves with ease and who moves around whom, which bodies carry themselves as if the space belongs to them and which carry themselves as if they are apologizing for existing inside it. It takes maybe 4 minutes to read a room correctly if you know what you're looking for. The common room at Hethdoran took 3. The Velhari clique sat in the center, not at the center table, the center of the room's social gravity, which is a different thing and more important. There were 7 of them and they were all seniors, and they had the easy, expansive body language of creatures who have never once entered a space uncertain of their welcome. Their trays were set wider than necessary. Their conversations carried. When they moved through the room to refill something or discard a tray, the room reorganized itself around their path without appearing to. The way water reorganizes itself around a boat's hull, without any individual particle making a conscious choice. The one at the head, the one whose crests rose a full hand width taller than the others, whose posture took up 40% more lateral space than it needed to, I cataloged as the principal. Not because of the crests, because of the way the others angled their attention toward him without appearing to, the way plants angle toward light without appearing to. He had the particular quality of someone who has been the organizing principle of a group for long enough that the group has forgotten it could be organized any other way. His name, I would learn, was Asik Var, junior senior of the Velhari Civic House Var, scholarship competitive track, 4th cycle enrollment. 17 years old, which in Velhari developmental terms is approximately equivalent to a human 19. He was, by any institutional measure, an accomplished student. He was also, by any operational measure, a bully of the organized and systematic variety, the kind that understands exactly how much pressure to apply to stay inside the rules, and that has thought carefully enough about the rules to know precisely where the margin is. I watched him for 3 minutes while eating broth, and then I looked away and finished my roll and took my tray to the return station and went to bed. That was day 1. What Asik Var's group did was not dramatic. That's the thing about organized, systematic bullying at the institutional level. It is specifically designed to avoid drama, because drama draws administrative attention and administrative attention is inconvenient. What it is, instead, is relentless. Small daily, calibrated to a road. A tray nudged off a table edge. A study carol reserved for a Velhari student 3 seconds before you sit down, accompanied by a long flat look that doesn't quite constitute a threat. A door held open for everyone except you. Your name pronounced with a particular subtle wrongness, a fractional drop in register that in Velhari social code means something approximately equivalent to lesser category, and that is deniable as accent variation to any administrator who asks. Common room seating that compresses very slightly whenever you approach, until the message is clear. The space contracts around you. The thing about a system like this is that it is invisible to anyone who is not inside it. I had observed enough of these systems, in enough different environments, to recognize the specific quality of the invisibility. The way the individual pieces are each too small to report, too deniable to document, too familiar to the targets to seem worth the effort of explaining. You cannot bring a 3-second carol reservation to the administrator's office. You cannot file a report about a door. The system depends on this. It is designed to stay below the threshold of the reportable while operating well above the threshold of the felt. The people inside it feel it every day. The people outside it see nothing out of the ordinary. I had seen this in other contexts and other species, and I knew precisely what it cost over time. The 9 human transfers were managing it. The 3 Dorathi were managing it. And they were managing it competently, which is a kind of strength, and they were paying for it quietly, which is a kind of price. They clustered. They ate at the same times and occupied the same corners and did not, under any circumstances, walk the corridor between the common room and the gymnasium alone after 1900 hours. I had watched them arrive at this accommodation independently, through observation, without anyone explaining it to me. It was competent adaptation to a bad situation. I respected it. Survival under sustained institutional pressure is not a small thing, and people who manage it deserve more credit than they usually get. I did not adopt the accommodation. About 3 weeks in, I watched what it costs. I was in the corridor outside the common room when Asik Var's group ran one of their standard sequences on Dav Rensk. He was one of the 9 human transfers, a 19-year-old who had been at Hethdoran 2 semesters and had adapted carefully to the compressed geography. 3 of the group had arrived at the corridor intersection at the same moment he did, not by accident, and the simple act of walking past required Dav to navigate around them rather than through them, because the Velhari physical footprint crests elevated, bodies angled to take the lateral space, made the center of the corridor functionally unavailable. He did it well. The accommodation was practiced and efficient. He stepped to the margin, head slightly down, passing without making contact or comment. He did not see me standing at the far end of the corridor. I watched his face as he cleared the group and walked toward me. He had the specific expression of someone who has successfully managed something they have had to manage many times, not relief, not anger, but the flat, even expression of a person whose system for absorbing pressure has become so practiced it no longer registers as pressure, just as process. He looked up and saw me. The expression did not change. He was past the point of embarrassment about it. "They do that a lot," he said when he reached me. "Yes," I said. He looked at me for a moment. "You don't cluster," he said. "No." "Why not?" I thought about how to answer that honestly without giving him something that wouldn't fit his situation. "Because clustering changes your relationship with the space," I said. "You start moving around a problem instead of through it, and after a while the problem doesn't have to do anything, you're doing the work for it." He thought about that. "What do you do instead?" "Right now," I said, "I watch." He looked at me with the specific attention of someone who has heard a statement that is clearly incomplete but is deciding whether to push on it. He decided not to, which I noted as a sign of patience. He nodded and went to his carrel, and I went to mine. That was 3 weeks in. I thought about that conversation a number of times over the weeks that followed. He was right that I was not clustering. He was also right, without knowing it, to wonder why, because what I was doing was not a different version of managing the situation. It was something else entirely. It was setting the conditions. I walked the corridors alone, at any hour I chose. I sat where I chose at mealtimes, at whatever table was nearest the wall and convenient. I went to the gymnasium at irregular hours and used the equipment without asking anyone's permission or making eye contact with anyone who might interpret presence as a request for social negotiation. When a tray was nudged off a table edge in my vicinity, I caught it before it landed, set it back, and said nothing. When my name was pronounced with that particular fractional wrongness, I answered to it pleasantly and moved on. When the seating near me compressed, I ate my food and gave no indication I had noticed, which I had precisely. None of this was accidental. All of it was deliberate. I was giving Asikvar's group a very specific picture of me, harmless, slightly oblivious, managing to maintain a vague good humor despite a social position that should have been demoralizing. A transfer who doesn't fully understand what's being done to her. A woman past her prime, carrying a civilian resettlement voucher, slightly out of place, trying to keep her head down and complete her coursework and not make trouble. Nobody, specifically and deliberately nobody. The reason I did this is the same reason a good ambush position looks like an empty hillside. You do not want the opposition thinking about you before the moment you have chosen. You want them comfortable and predictable and completely focused on something other than what you actually are. A target that reads as uninteresting is a target that is not being watched, and a target that is not being watched can move. I had 22 years of practice at this also. The cover was not difficult to maintain. The harder discipline, in my experience, is remembering that you are maintaining it, that the woman eating broth and reading ecology texts and saying "excuse me" when the seating compresses is a performance, not a surrender, that the nobody is a costume, not a diagnosis. Some days are easier than others for remembering that. The escalation, when it came at week 6. This was later than I had estimated. I had given it 4 weeks, but Asikvar was patient for his age, and he had been watching me as carefully as I had been watching him. He wanted to be certain before he moved. He was reading me the way competent people read uncertain situations, accumulating observations before acting on them. That told me something useful about him. He was intelligent, and he planned, and he had enough operational caution to wait for his reading to solidify before he committed. That made him more competent than the average institutional bully and also marginally more predictable, because competent planners tend to move in patterns, and patterns have shapes you can anticipate. The sparring annex is on the station's second level, adjacent to the gymnasium. It is a compact, compliant, multi-species combat training space, padded floor, 3 meters of ceiling clearance, wall-mounted equipment racks, one observation gallery with seating for approximately 30. The ceiling clearance was Velhari calibrated. Velhari elevated crests can reach 2.5 meters, and a ceiling that clips a raised crest mid-engagement is both a safety issue and an insult. Hethdoran uses the annex for the required physical conditioning curriculum and, informally, for what the Velhari call the Vethoran, the standing circle. It is not in the Institute's official student conduct code. It is also not prohibited, because the administration has decided, with the particular wisdom of institutions that prefer not to be complicated, that the Vethoran functions as a social integration mechanism for cross-species student cohorts, and that maintaining a position on it would require more effort than the alternative. What it actually is, a ritual challenge system that allows senior Velhari students to formally invite a junior or transfer student to a witness sparring match. Declining is technically optional. In practice, within the Velhari social framework that dominates Hethdoran's student culture, declining reads as a specific category of submission that makes everything that comes after substantially worse. The Dorathi knew this from their first week. The human transfers had learned it over previous semesters. It is the reason the transfer cohort clustered and avoided the corridor alone, and had developed the particular careful stillness of people who are managing the distance between two bad options. Asekvar delivered the invitation to my study carrel at 1400 hours on a Wednesday, with 2 members of his group standing behind him in the specifically calibrated arrangement that signals formal witnessing in Velhari social protocol: present, visible, positioned to observe and report. He was polite about it. He used my name correctly, which took a visible effort of adjustment, and the effort itself was information. He said the Vethoran was a tradition of the Institute, and that he hoped I would participate, as a way of integrating more fully into the student community. He made it sound generous. He was, I noted, genuinely good at this. I set down the ecology text I was reading and looked at him for a moment. "What time?" I said. He told me, 1800 hours that evening. I noted the speed of the answer. He had had a time prepared, which meant he had had the question prepared, which meant he expected me to accept. His assessment of me had solidified into a conclusion he was confident in, and the time was an operational detail, ready to deploy. I was expected to say yes. "All right," I said, and picked up my ecology text. He waited for something more. A question about the format, a request for clarification, some small indication of anxiety or uncertainty. When none came, he exchanged a glance with his witnesses. I watched the glance from my peripheral vision, a quick communicative flash that in Velhari register translates roughly as, "This is going to be easy," and then they left. The sound of their footsteps receded down the corridor, with the unhurried cadence of people who have somewhere to be, and no doubts about what happens when they get there. I read for another 40 minutes, then set the text aside and lay back on the bunk and looked at the curved ceiling for a while. It had been 4 years since I had last put my hands on someone in a sparring context. My last operational deployment had been 6 years before that. 10 years of desk work and debriefs and transition programs and committee reviews. And finally, this scholarship, which the compact resettlement officer had pressed on me with the slightly frantic energy of someone who has been given a mandate to reintegrate veterans into civilian life, and is not entirely certain the available frameworks are adequate to the actual cases presenting. I was 47. I did not carry the same body I had carried at 25. I had 3 fused vertebrae from a deployment in the Seth Corridor, the result of a structural collapse that killed 2 people I had trained with and would have killed a third if she had been standing 18 centimeters to her left. A knee that complains about certain angles of descent, particularly in low-gravity transitions, which aboard an orbital station is a consideration. A left shoulder that has a small but specific range of motion it does not enjoy, the legacy of a grappling sequence that resolved in my favor, but extracted a price I have been paying in small installments ever since. None of this concerned me in any operational sense. Asik Var was 17, and his sparring training consisted of whatever Heth Doran's physical conditioning curriculum had provided plus whatever informal practice the Vethoran had given him. He was larger than me by approximately a third of my body mass, and quicker in his natural reflexes, and he had crests that in serious Velhari combat function as both a weapon and a close-range sensory amplifier. The crest structure contains pressure receptors that sharpen spatial awareness in enclosed environments, which gives Velhari fighters a genuine close-quarters advantage over species that rely on vision alone. What he did not have, and could not have, and had never had the particular misfortune of needing to acquire, was any idea of what he was actually walking toward. I thought about that for a moment. I thought about whether I felt anything about what was coming. The honest answer was, not much. Something in the low register of mild anticipation, the way you feel when you have been waiting for a logistical problem to resolve itself and can see that it is about to. A small, clean clarity. The low-level ambient noise that the long, uncertain weeks produce, the adapted small posture, the watched exits, the careful navigation of a space that has decided you are less, falls away when you have a fixed point to move toward. The fog lifts. You can see the ground. I got up, did 30 minutes of careful warm-up that anyone watching would have read as the kind of tentative stretching a civilian in her late 40s might do before an athletic event. She is nervous about slow, a little uncertain at the joints, pausing to work around apparent stiffness, and went to the sparring annex. The gallery was full. Not because Asik Var had announced anything formally. Word in a boarding school does not require announcements. It requires only the correct conversation in the correct corridor, the specific energy of something anticipated, and a student body with nothing more pressing at 1800 hours on a Wednesday than to see what happens to the quiet transfer woman. There were 26 students in the seats when I entered, which was essentially the entire active student body excluding those on evening study restriction. The 9 human transfers were there, in a cluster near the gallery's upper end, with the particular body language of people who have learned that witnessing is safer than not witnessing, because at least you know what happened. The 3 Dorathi were there, crowded into one corner with the focused stillness of creatures who had developed an expert understanding of when to be invisible. Asik Var's group occupied the front 2 rows, crests raised, the collective body language of predators at rest who are expecting to watch something easy and satisfying. I stepped onto the padded floor. I was wearing the Institute's standard physical conditioning kit, gray shorts, gray top, impact-rated foot coverings. I had declined the impact padding offered by the annex's equipment rack, which produced a brief communicative glance between Asik Var's witnesses, a glance that read, again in Velhari register, as even better. They interpreted it as either bravado or ignorance. I noted both interpretations and discarded neither. Asik Var stepped onto the floor opposite me. He was in his conditioning kit, crests fully elevated in the Velhari combat posture, a configuration that makes the individual physically larger and activates the crest's sensory amplification function. He had excellent posture. His balance was good. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who has done this many times and won all of them. The Institute's sparring protocol required a brief verbal acknowledgement. Both parties confirm they are participating voluntarily. The match is for form and training purposes. no intent to cause lasting injury. Standard compact cross-species safety framework, designed to create a clear administrative record of consent. Asekvar delivered his portion correctly and pleasantly. His tone was almost generous, the generosity of someone who believes they are being gracious to a weaker party. I delivered mine. I kept my voice the same way I had kept my face for 6 weeks, mild, slightly uncertain, a woman doing her best with an unfamiliar situation. Then we stood in the ready position and the gallery quieted, and Asekvar looked at me across the floor, and I looked back at him, and there was a moment. In that moment, something shifted in his eyes. Not much, just a fraction, the kind of recalibration that happens below the threshold of decision, in the part of the brain that processes information before it reaches the part that acts. He had been reading me for 6 weeks and his read was solid, but something in the way I was standing, not my expression, not any movement, just the specific quality of my stillness and the way my weight was placed and the particular evenness of my attention, did not quite match the woman he had built in his head. He could not have named what was wrong with the picture, but something was. He moved fast. I will give him that. He was good, the lunge was clean, his leverage angle correct for a target of my approximate size and mass, his intent to secure a dominant grip position before I could establish any meaningful defense. In a match against another Velhari senior of comparable training, or against a young human with standard conditioning curriculum preparation, it would have worked exactly as planned. I was not there when he arrived. That sounds cleaner than it is in execution. What I did was not a dramatic sidestep. There was no flourish, no performance. I moved left by about 40 centimeters, shifted my weight distribution along a line his momentum had already committed away from, and used the grip he had intended as his opening control as the leverage point for the throw. The whole sequence took approximately 1.3 seconds from his initiation to his impact. The mechanics of it were not complicated. They were simply not the mechanics of anyone who had learned to fight in a sparring annex. Asekvar hit the padded floor. The gallery made a sound. Not a cheer, not a gasp, something between the two, a collective intake that cut off before it resolved into anything coherent. The Velhari in the front rows had gone very still. A few crests that had been elevated in relaxed authority shifted to a different configuration, the one associated with active attention, the sensory alert posture rather than the social dominance one. Asekvar was up in 2 seconds, quick recovery. He was angry now, I could see it in the crests, which had changed from elevated authority to elevated combat, a different configuration, tighter and forward, but he was controlling it, which was credit to his training and his intelligence. He didn't rush. He took a half second, visible, to recalibrate, and then came in again. Lower this time. He had read my weight shift and adjusted his entry angle to account for the direction I had moved. He was learning in real time, which is the sign of a genuinely capable fighter. He adjusted correctly. He just did not have enough data yet to know what he was adjusting toward. I let him get closer this time. The Velhari are strong, and their default close quarters instinct is to lock, to establish grip and use mass and leverage, and the crest's sensory function to find angles of control, and then maintain them until the opponent makes an error. I know this not because I studied the Velhari sparring curriculum, but because I spent 11 months in the Ashvit campaign working in environments where Velhari military doctrine was the standard opposition. And I had 4 personnel under my command who needed to be able to neutralize it when the alternative was not leaving the field. You learn a thing differently when the alternative is dying. The information goes to a different place and it stays there. He locked my left arm. It was a good lock. He was strong, the angle was correct, and against standard resistance it would have been an effective control. I let him have it for 1 second, felt his weight commit fully to maintaining the position, and then I moved with it instead of against it, let the force carry past the point he was bracing for, redirected the lever and put him on the floor again. Different fall this time. He landed on his side with enough impact that there was a full second before he moved. The gallery was completely silent. I stepped back to the center of the floor and stood in the ready position, weight even, breathing steady, and waited. Asekvar got up, slower this time. He stood across from me, and his crests were doing something I had not seen in the previous 6 weeks, a specific complex rotation that in Velhari social biology indicates a significant mid-situation reassessment. Not retreat, not submission, genuine recalibration, the system processing information that does not fit its existing models and revising the models. He was looking at me with the specific quality of attention that you develop when you have discovered that your target is not what you thought, and you are working out in real time what it actually is. I stayed in the ready position and let him look. He came forward a third time. Not angry now, or not only angry, something harder, something that I have encountered before and that I respect. The specific quality of a creature who has decided to find out the actual answer regardless of what it costs them. He had adjusted his approach based on both previous exchanges, changed his entry angle, managed his weight distribution differently, carried a secondary plan in how he was positioning his offhand. If he had been sparring against someone who simply had my general physical profile and a standard range of institutional training, he would have been competitive by the third exchange. The third exchange lasted 9 seconds. I let it go long deliberately, not to demonstrate range, but because he had earned the longer look. He was working hard and working intelligently, and honest intelligence deserves a fair test. He landed one strike, a glancing contact to my right forearm where his instinct had correctly read the trajectory of my block. That was honest work. I noted it. Then I found the opening he had been protecting with his secondary plan, moved through it in the window before he could close, and put him on the floor a third time. This time I followed through to the control position, arm locked, knee braced, the hold clean and final. I held it for 3 seconds, the standard completion signal in compact sparring protocol. Then I released, stood, and stepped back. Asekvar lay on the floor for a moment. Then he pushed himself up onto one arm and then to sitting and then to standing. He was breathing hard. His crests were in a configuration I had seen before in the field in Velhari soldiers after an engagement they had not expected to go the way it went. Not surrender, not the performance of submission. Something more fundamental, the system's active revision. The previous model of the situation being set aside, and a new one being constructed from available data. He looked at me, I looked at him. The gallery was so quiet I could hear the station's ventilation cycling. I said, "Good adjustments. The third entry was better." He said nothing for a moment. His crest configuration shifted again, not toward aggression, not toward the social dominance posture he had been carrying for 6 weeks. Something different. Something that, in a Velhari face, takes a specific kind of encounter to produce. He held my gaze for another second, then nodded once, a single downward movement that in Velhari social code means, "I have received the information and registered it accurately." Then he stepped off the floor. The gallery did not make noise. That is the thing I remember most clearly about the moment after. Not a cheer, not a murmur, just the specific quality of silence that a room produces when it is revising something fundamental. The human transfers in the upper gallery were very still. I noted from peripheral vision that the young man I had spoken with in the corridor 3 weeks earlier, Dav Rensk, was gripping the gallery railing with both hands and looking at the floor, not at me. Not with embarrassment, with the expression of someone who has just watched something they had believed was fixed turn out to be movable. That is a specific feeling, and it takes a moment to locate yourself inside it. The 3 Dorathi in their corner were also still. One of them, the small one, the one who clustered nearest the food station, was watching me with very dark eyes and not looking away. I met her gaze for 1 second, then looked back at the floor. Asekvar's group came forward from the gallery, not in the organized, pressure-amplified way they had been operating for 6 weeks. They came forward differently, individually or in pairs, with less coordination, the group's internal geometry looser than I had seen it. Some of them were talking among themselves quietly. The communicative register was different, not the lateral glances and shared frequency efficiency of a group running a coordinated system, but the more disorganized sound of people who are genuinely not certain what to say next. A couple of them spoke to Asek Var. He answered. I watched the group's internal architecture shift the way a room shifts when someone moves the largest piece of furniture. Everything adjusts to the new center of gravity, not all at once but progressively, each piece finding its position in relation to a different anchor. I picked up a towel from the equipment rack and dried my hands and face. My left shoulder was registering its usual complaint about the range of motion required by the second exchange, a low-grade familiar displeasure I had factored in approximately 6 weeks ago when I decided how this was going to go. I had known it would be there. I had decided it was acceptable, a small price for a necessary outcome. I have paid larger ones for less. The next morning, the Velhari clique's seating arrangement in the common room was different. Not dramatically different, not absent. The group still sat together. Social arrangements with that degree of institutional investment don't dissolve overnight, and I would not have wanted them to. Abrupt dissolution would have created a different kind of instability, and instability is only useful when you can direct it towards something better. What had changed was the specific geometry. The way they occupied the center of the room's social gravity was fractionally less expansive. A degree of lateral space returned to the tables around them. The compression that had been operating on the human transfer cohort's movements for 2 semesters was reduced by a perceptible margin. Asek Var was at his usual seat. When I came in with my tray, he met my eyes across the room. Not a challenge. Not the flat, controlled assessment I had been receiving for 6 weeks. The specific quality of attention that one creature pays to another creature it has decided requires accurate classification and is still working out how to place. He held the look for 1 second, then returned to his food. I sat at the end of my table and ate my broth and roll. At 900, I had ecological systems, which met in a curved classroom on the 3rd level with 7 other students including 1 Dorathi and 2 Velhari, not in Asek Var's primary group. The instructor was a human woman named Dr. Pelham, who had been teaching at Hethdoran since its 2nd year of operation, and who had in the way of people who spend years inside a complex institutional social ecology developed an extremely accurate picture of its dynamics without ever quite finding the leverage to alter them. She knew what the Vethoran was. She knew what the compressed social geography of the transfer cohort looked like. She had made the same administrative calculation the rest of the administration had made, and she was not, I suspected, entirely comfortable with it. She looked at me when I sat down in the particular way she had been looking at me for 6 weeks, slightly more carefully than the other students, as if I were a known variable she hadn't yet correctly placed in the equation. I had the sense she was waiting for something. She did not comment on anything. The class proceeded. We were covering resource cycling in closed orbit habitats. I had read the text twice and attended every session and done the assigned problems. I asked one question about the failure cascade modeling in the 3rd chapter. Dr. Pelham answered it with a slight upward shift of her attention. It was a specific kind of question, the kind that comes from someone who has worked inside a closed orbit habitat and is checking the text's model against a more complicated actual experience. I had worked inside a number of closed orbit habitats. I was checking the model. After class, as the room cleared, Dr. Pelham said, "Ms. Voss, do you have a moment?" It was not a question. I sat back down. She waited until the room was clear, then pulled a chair from behind her desk and sat across from me, which was not her usual mode. Sitting meant she had decided this was a different kind of conversation than the standing kind she had with students. "I heard about last night," she said. "I assumed you would," I said. "You're not what the intake paperwork describes." The intake paperwork describes a civilian resettlement transfer on an academic scholarship, I said. That's accurate. She looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone who has been handed a technically correct statement and is deciding whether to accept the ground rules it implies. I have been at this institute for 11 years, she said. The Vethoron has operated continuously for 9 of them. I have watched 7 transfer cohorts move through it. I have never seen what you did last night. I hope the institute isn't going to have a problem with the outcome, I said. The sparring protocol was observed. No, the institute won't have a problem with it. She looked at the wall for a second, then back at me. What I'm trying to say is that last night is going to have consequences for the students who watched it, and I want to understand what I'm dealing with. I thought about that for a moment. I'm 47 years old, I said. I have a compact resettlement voucher and an academic scholarship and 2 bags and a bunk near the door in the transfer dormitory. That's what you're dealing with. And before that is filed under a different access level. You're welcome to query the compact resettlement office. They'll confirm the scholarship and the civilian transfer status and not very much else. She was quiet. Are you dangerous? She said. I'm currently enrolled in ecological systems, I said. I have homework due on the 14th. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, something more considered and more honest. The Vethoron, she said. After last night, do you expect further challenges? I thought about it honestly. Not from Osik Var. He's intelligent and he's recalibrated and he'll take the information and adjust. The ones I'm less certain about are members of his group who weren't directly involved in reading me. They had a second-hand picture, and second-hand pictures are always less accurate. I paused. But I think probably not. The Vethoron functions on a certain model of who the available targets are. I am no longer in that category. She held the look, the other transfers, the 9 humans. They'll be fine, I said. How do you know? Because the group running the system has to reconsider what the system is actually for, now that it's produced an unexpected outcome. That takes time. And in my experience, the time a group spends reconsidering is time it doesn't spend on anything else. Dr. Pelham sat with that for a moment. Then she put the chair back behind her desk, stood, and said, Homework due on the 14th. 3rd chapter, problems 7 through 11. I've done 8 through 11, I said. I had a question about 7. Bring it next session, she said, and picked up her materials and left. The consequences came in a form I had anticipated, and a form I had not. The anticipated one. Osik Var's group did reconsider. For approximately 10 days, the social architecture of the common room was in genuine transition. The compression on the human transfer cohort's social geography decreased by measurable degrees. Not because the group had decided to be kind. I was not operating under any illusions about the depth of the change, but because a system running on a perceived asymmetry of risk recalibrates when that perception is updated. The bandwidth that had been running the compression routine was occupied with the recalibration. The pressure reduced as a consequence, not as a gift. The unanticipated one came on the 9th day, in the form of a 19-year-old human named Dav Rensk. Dav had been at Hethdoran for 2 semesters. Shoulder-length dark hair, medium height, the specific quality of stillness that develops in people who have learned to make themselves uninteresting in order to survive a complicated environment. He was, from 6 weeks of observation, a competent reader of rooms and a careful adapter. He was also carrying a particular weight that had nothing to do with coursework, the weight of having survived a sustained bad situation by progressively reducing the space you take up, which is effective as a survival strategy and expensive as a way to live. He found me in the library on the 9th day, where I was working through a problem set. He sat down across from me and put his hands flat on the table and looked at me for a moment with the look of someone who has decided what they want to say and is checking it one final time before they say it. The match, he said. What you did, you've done that before a lot. Not quite a question. Sit down, I said. He was already sitting. He seemed to notice this, and something in his face released a small fraction. What did you do, he said, before this? I set down my pen. I looked at him for a moment, the careful stillness, the adapted posture, the weight. There are things I won't tell you, I said. Not because you don't have a right to know them, but because they're not mine to give. Ask what you actually want to ask. He was quiet for a moment, then how? A single word carrying a larger question than most people ask with a paragraph. How do you carry what you carry and still sit in a common room eating nutritional broth and wait 6 weeks and then walk onto a mat and do what you did, and then come back and eat breakfast and go to ecological systems? How do you exist like that, with whatever is behind you, and be intact? Fine is the wrong word, I said. You look fine, he said. Everyone in this station is looking at you differently since last night, and you're exactly the same. I'm not the same, I said. I'm practiced at this part, the part after. I picked up my pen. The years before, they were what they were. You don't come back from them unchanged. But you develop, if you're patient with yourself, a different relationship with being in motion. You stop expecting to arrive somewhere stable and start understanding that the point is to keep moving well, to be useful, to keep your eyes open. He looked at me. That's not a satisfying answer, he said. No. A pause. Can you teach me anything? I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about 2 semesters of careful adaptation, the progressively reduced posture, the clustered movement, the practice not attracting attention. I thought about what that does to a person over time, not just the physical compression but the interior one, the part where you stop trusting your own reading of a room, because the room has been telling you for months that your reading doesn't matter. What do you want to learn? I said. What you did on the mat. That's going to take longer than a semester, and it starts with things that have nothing to do with a mat. Okay, he said. There are other things you might want to learn first, I said. Things that will help in the shorter term with the specific situation you're in, how to read a room, not what it looks like, what it actually is, who the weight is coming from and why, and what happens to the weight when you shift something else. You've been adapting to this system for 2 semesters. That means you've been letting the system define the parameters. Understanding a system and adapting to it are different skills. He thought about that. Understanding lets you do what you did, he said. Change something. Understanding lets you choose, I said. What you do with the choice is separate. He nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement. Okay, he said. We sat in the library for another hour and a half. I finished 2 problems in my set. He worked on his interspecies governance essay, which he was behind on. We did not talk much, but there was a quality to the silence that was different from the common room silence, not the silence of people managing their presence in a hostile space, but the silence of people doing work that matters. The kind where something is being assembled quietly, without any announcement about the assembly. At the end of the hour and a half, he closed his notebook and looked at me. The reading room's thing, he said. Where do you start? You've already started, I said. You came in here and you read me well enough to decide the conversation was worth having. That's the first step, knowing when a room has something in it worth engaging with. He thought about that. What's the second step? Knowing what to do with what you read, I said, which takes longer. Come back Thursday morning, 6:30, gymnasium. Bring the conditioning kit. He came back Thursday, and the Thursday after, and every session that followed. I want to be accurate about what happened and what did not, because I have seen people tell these stories clean when the actual stories are not clean. The Vethoran did not disappear. Asekvar's group did not disband. The Velhari social architecture at Hethdoran did not restructure itself overnight because one transfer put their senior on the floor 3 times. Institutions are more durable than single events, and social architectures are more durable than institutions. What happened was more modest and more real. The compression on the human transfer cohort decreased and did not fully return. The specific operational texture of Osekvar's group changed, the calibrated pressure method reduced, because a system running on the perception of asymmetric risk recalibrates when that perception shifts. This is not justice. It is mechanics. But mechanics, applied consistently, can produce outcomes that look from the outside like something more. Osekvar himself was more interesting than I had initially credited. Intelligent, genuinely capable of updating his model, and once he updated it, he operated differently. He did not become cordial. We were not going to be friends, and the distance was appropriate and mutual. But he withdrew the specific operations his group had been running on the transfer cohort with a directness that I read as coming from a genuine reassessment rather than a strategic retreat. At one point, approximately 3 weeks after the match, he stopped me in the corridor outside the library and asked about the Ashvit campaign for a history project he was working on. I told him I was not a resource on the Ashvit campaign and referred him to the compact public archive. He nodded and said thank you and went. I had 2 more Vethoran challenges over the course of the semester, not from Osekvar's group, from individuals peripherally connected to it, carrying second-hand pictures of me that were less accurate than the direct picture his group had updated. Both challenges I accepted. Both matches were brief. Both individuals walked away with accurate pictures and no lasting damage, and I was as honest as I could be about what the matches were and were not demonstrating. I did not explain what I was. I simply was it. Davrensk and I worked together twice a week through the rest of the semester. Early mornings in the gymnasium, before the study period started and the space filled. We worked on reading rooms first, the way I had said we would, not the surface reading, who is where, but the structural reading, where the weight is coming from and why, what shifts when you move a particular piece. Then the specific mechanics of the adapted small posture, what it does to your proprioception over time, how you redevelop range of motion that months of deliberate compression have reduced. Then eventually some rudimentary positioning work, not sparring, not the choreography of an exchange, but the simpler and more important question of how you exist in a space, how you occupy a room in a way that reads as present, how you let the geometry work with you rather than navigating around it. He was a good student, not a prodigy. He didn't have the particular spatial intuition that makes physical learning fast. He had something more useful, careful work, good questions, and no repeated mistakes. The ones I have found reliable throughout my career were rarely the prodigies. They were the ones who worked carefully, asked the right questions, and did not make the same mistake twice. I should say clearly what the gymnasium sessions were and were not. They were not combat training. I was not arming him, and I was not trying to produce in him what I am. What I was trying to do was simpler. Give back the range of motion he had voluntarily surrendered over 2 semesters, the spatial confidence that the accommodation had been gradually eroding. The physical work was partly about the physical proprioception, posture, learning to move through space without the constant micro-calculation of whether the space was going to push back. But mostly, it was a different kind of practice. The practice of being present in a space without apologizing for the presence. Of arriving in a room and not immediately locating the least conspicuous position. Of taking up the amount of space a person actually takes up, not the amount they have been taught to negotiate down to. These are not skills you can teach directly. They are things you practice until they become the default. That takes time and repetition and someone to tell you, when you fall back into the old default, what they are seeing and why it matters. By the end of the semester, his posture in the common room had changed. Nothing performed or announced. The adapted small compression was simply gone, replaced by the amount of space a person actually takes up when they have decided that the space is theirs to occupy. That is a small thing. It is also, depending on what you are carrying, the hardest. One of the Dorathi stopped me in the corridor outside the library near the end of the semester. She was small even by Dorothy standards, and she had the specific posture of a creature that has been being very careful for a very long time. The careful stillness that looks from the outside like timidity, and is, from the inside, something much more expensive. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said something in Dorothy that I do not speak, caught herself, and said in the Institute's standard language, "You changed something." "A little," I said. "More than a little," she said. She held my eyes with dark, steady ones. "You were nobody. For 6 weeks you were nobody. And then—" "I was always the same person," I said. "The nobody was a choice." She thought about that. "How do you choose to be nothing when you are something?" she said. "That seems very difficult." I thought about it honestly. "It is not difficult," I said. "It is practice. The difficult part is remembering that being nothing is the choice and that you can make a different one." She held my eyes for a moment, then nodded in the Dorothy way, a different gesture from the Velhari acknowledgement, carrying its own weight, and went back to her corner. The scholarship runs 2 academic years. I am in my first. I have ecological systems, history of interspecies governance, applied physics, and a writing seminar I joined late in the semester, but that has proved more interesting than I anticipated. It turns out I have opinions about prose that I did not know I had, and the instructor is good enough to argue with. The compact resettlement officer who processed my paperwork had looked at my file for a long time before signing off on the placement. He was a competent officer who had processed many resettlement cases, and he understood, I think, that mine was not a straightforward one. He looked up finally and said, "Why this? Secondary schooling. Why Heth Doran?" I had told him, "I need a credential, and the Institute has a library." Which is true. I do need a credential, and the library is genuinely excellent. It is not the whole answer. The whole answer is that 22 years is a long time to be one thing, and the weight of it does not decrease by being set down. It decreases, in my experience, only by being carried somewhere useful. This is a place where things are being built, slowly and imperfectly, and with all the difficulty that building things involves. 19 humans and 3 Dorothy and 40-some Velhari, trying to learn how to occupy the same space in the aftermath of a war that rearranged the geometry of what was possible. It is not clean work. It produces no satisfying payoffs on any particular day. But it is work, and I have all my life been better at work than at standing still. The library opens at 6:30. I am usually there by 6:35. There is a corner table near the reference stacks with a sight line to the door and good ambient light, and I work there until the morning study period ends and the day begins to move. The homework accumulates and I work through it, problem by problem, the way I have always worked through things. The questions arise and I ask them. On Thursday mornings, Dav meets me in the gymnasium at 6:15. He is getting better at reading the room. He is also slowly getting back some of the posture he spent 2 semesters compressing out of himself. These are related things. They always are. The weeks proceed. Asikvar's group occupies the common room, the Dorothy cluster by the food station, though with fractionally more ease than before. The 9 human transfers still eat together, because eating together is not the same as being afraid to eat apart, and the distinction matters. Dr. Pelham watches me from across the classroom with the expression of someone who has found where the unknown variable sits in the equation and is still deciding what to do with the answer. I bring her my questions about problem 7. She argues with my conclusions. The arguments are worth having. I let them think I was nobody. They found out what nobody looks like. And now, quietly, we get back to work.